Because instead of the gimmicky populism espoused by our Conservatives and Scottish nationalists, their political leaders say that resource conservation and the environment must come first. They advocate green taxes on oil. And Britain needs a political party with the courage and political maturity to spell out the same message. Now, there will be a great deal of pain in the coming recession. And what makes pain worse is the knowledge that it's unfairly distributed. I mean, it isn't possible to have a sense of society, let alone of patriotism, when hard-working families and pensioners pay through the nose while others don't pay their share and dodge taxes through tax havens or tax avoidance scams. Now, I keep reading in the press that some of our activists don't like the language of tax cutting and they think it's right-wing. But I don't see what's right-wing about wanting to cut the taxes of millions of people who earn less or barely more than the equivalent of the minimum wage. We know from the backlash against the loss of the 10p tax rate just how strongly low and middle income households feel about tax. Standard rate taxpayers currently pay 31 pence in every extra pound they earn on their income to the taxman. And that's on top of what's clawed back through wickedly overcomplicated, means-tested benefits and tax credits. Now, any rational person faced with this wall of disincentives will ask, why should I bother to work? Why should I bother to save? And we have an opportunity, more than an opportunity, we have a duty to confront this problem head-on and to become a tax-cutting party. And that's why Nick Clegg is absolutely right to have made this issue the central focus of debate for our party. Now, tax cuts, of course, cannot just be conjured out of thin air. We say that tax cuts should mostly be paid for by those who currently don't pay their fair share. How can it be right, for example, that the rate of tax on capital gains on second homes is less than half what it was under Nigel Lawson and Mrs. Thatcher, or half that on earned income? How can it be right that people with million-pound pension pots don't just have more tax relief, but a higher rate of tax relief on all their contributions? And how can it be right that failed executives, paid massive sums in golden goodbyes, can claim the first £30,000 tax-free? This must stop. So we must declare war on the antisocial practices of rich individuals and companies who avoid tax. And that means we've got to target tax havens in our dependent territory. And I was brought up to feel proud of those atlases covered with the red of the British Empire. But it's now a source of shame that the last few bits of British rock have been turned over to tax dodgers, from the Channel Islands to the Cayman and Virgin Islands. I think British hard-pressed taxpayers might well ask, for example, why our country's biggest retailer, Tesco, should be packing up billions of pounds of British property in the Cayman Islands to avoid stamp duty. Now, some of you might say, and you will say this afternoon, that if you can raise more tax from the well-off and tax dodgers, why not spend it all on public services rather than cutting taxes? And I'm often told that in Sweden and Denmark, people are happy to see half of the country's GDP raised in tax and publicly spent. But there is a difference. These are highly decentralized democracies which raise far more tax, including income tax, and make big spending decisions locally. There is real democratic accountability. Now, we've got to commit ourselves to working towards those structures in Britain, decentralising from central to local government. But in the meantime, we have a public sector which is all too often bloated, over-centralised, incompetent, and unaccountable. Now, I believe that there are areas where more public money could usefully be spent on schools and further and adult education and mental health and law and order and the state pension. And despite being a tight-fisted Treasury spokesman, I support selective increases in public spending. But we also need to challenge in a fundamental way many of the things which government spends money on. We've already spoken out against industrial subsidies and payments to big farmers, the unnecessary child trust fund, and the means-tested tax credit, which extend into the upper income range, the ID cards, the superfluous and extravagant defence contracts designed mainly to fill the order books of the defence contractors, and widening further the bottomless pit of the nuclear power industry. We've got to stop the gravy train of management consultancy in government. We've got to stop questionable government IT projects like that for the NHS and insist that procurement is from the cheapest open source, and take an axe to the overgrown thickets of Quangoland. Now, the coward's way of dealing with public spending is to sack or squeeze the pay of low-paid public sector workers. The correct way is to start at the top. I mean, I would require every non-frontline public sector employee on £100,000 or more to reapply for their jobs. And those allowed back would take a cut in pay and public sector pension entitlement. And politicians, us, we can't lead a crusade against self-serving public sector extravagance unless we lead from the front. So MPs and ministers have got to accept deep cuts in their numbers and fringe benefits like pensions. The central message is that government should do fewer things well rather than many things badly. And that will help us to generate the resources to deliver Nick Clegg's pledge to hand money back to ordinary people. Now, in conclusion, I don't believe that economic policy is simply a matter of pulling policy levers and making numbers add up. It has to be rooted in a sense of values and a very clear narrative about the kind of society we want to see. I think there is a new mood. It's a mood of austerity. It's a reaction against greed and excess and waste and tax cheating and selfish, self-indulgent behaviour. It's an intolerance of binge lending by banks and binge spending by government. It's a craving for economic and personal security and sobriety and discipline, a demand that there is respect for fellow citizens and for the natural environment. And no other political party has yet found the language or the policies for this new world.